Good evening, everyone. My name is Terrian Young, and I will be chairing this third session for today. As the chairperson for today's proceeding, it is my honor to welcome our panelists, Dr. Marsha Hines-Murray and Mr. Russell Watson. This group presentation will be delivered using a multifaceted approach. First, we'll be viewing a video on interview media as a 21st century advocacy tool in the Caribbean, industrial schools, truth and reconciliation. After that, we'll get into the question and answer segment. So please don't forget to put your questions and comments in the chat box where our panelists will be very happy to answer your question. This presentation is around 20 minutes long, so please begin the video.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this panel where Russell Watson and myself talk about media as a 21st century advocacy tool in the Caribbean, industrial schools, truth and reconciliation. My name is Marsha Hines-Murray, and I have been doing work around the government industrial school in Barbados, just trying to create more understanding around the issue as well as to really fight for legislative change to make sure that we're not, doing detriment to our children in the way that we have been. In this discussion today, I sit down with, like I said, Russell Watson. Russell is a lecturer in cinematography at the University of the West Indies Cape Hill campus. His areas of concentration are theater and digital imagery. He is the lead artist of Our Studio, a multimedia workshop that offers a wide range
Él
of
es
photo,
el
video, and
autor
graphic services to
principal de
diverse
un
countries,
taller
including corporate entities,
de
government agencies,
múltiples
theater companies,
medios
fine artists, and
y
academics.
también ha tenido
And
conversación
Russell became
con
involved
varias
with Government
agencias.
Industrial School
Russell
project as provider of his
había
services.
participado
And
en
this
los
conversation
proyectos
that we are having
industriales
today
del
kind of,
gobierno. Había
it was a
ofrecido
conversation that
sus
we'd had before
servicios
about
y la
some of the issues around the
conversación
government
que
industrial school and the work that we
tenemos
were doing.
hoy día
And I said to Russell,
tiene que
this
ver con los
conversation
temas
could be one that is useful
relativos al
to other
gobierno, que
academics and
tiene
other
que ver
advocates
con el trabajo
who
que
are also
nosotros
doing this
estamos
work in other
haciendo.
regions.
Entonces,
And
esa
Russell
es una conversación que
graciously
podría
agreed
ser
for us to
útil
replicate these
para
conversations.
nosotros y para
And I'm so thankful.
investigadores que
Russell, welcome.
están haciendo
Thank
un
you,
trabajo
Marsha. Thanks for having me.
semejante.
Now, one of the things that I always
Gracias,
want to make
Marsha.
sure
Gracias por
when I'm doing
haberme
the work that I
invitado.
do is that I'm doing it in a
Entonces,
historically correct way.
yo
There are
quiero
many people
asegurarme
who have
de
fought for the rights
hacer
of
este
just
trabajo de
us
una
as Black
manera
people
correctamente
in the Caribbean for so
histórica.
very long.
Entonces hay
And
muchas
sometimes we get
personas
caught up with the
que
buzzwords,
consideran que
so we're talking
nosotros,
now about
los
grounded
negros
research and
del
we're talking about
Caribe, somos
community
personas
engaged research. But really, I
violentas.
think that there's
Nosotros
always
estamos
been a
hablando
very strong
de
tradition and culture of working in that way at the University of the West Indies. And so I feel as though I belong to this tradition in which art forms an important part of resistance and struggle, right? Beyond all of what we're talking about, the struggles and that kind of thing, we've always done that as Caribbean people. Do you agree with that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree totally. I think, for me, growing up in the Caribbean, my first engagements with art were, I guess, what we call now activist art or community-based development art, art that was focused on those kinds of objectives. One of my very earliest memories is going to what was then called Yoruba House for a performance, and I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, but experienced West African drumming and dance. And that, that was very much part of my growing up, and it wasn't until I was much older that I realized how transgressive a space that really was. And that work was, mirrored and compounded by what was going on in the Calypso tents. The lyricists in the Calypso sense, the Calypsonians have always been identified as people who are speaking of the social climate from an individual perspective. It is protest aestheticized. We find it in poetry and theater, as I said, in dance and performance. I think of, one of the earliest poets that I encountered and became fascinated with as a young teenager was Martin Carter, who ended up going to prison for his words, right? So this is a long tradition in I would say art in general. I think art has a protest imperative because it does speak the unspoken in a way that I think journalists and news agencies and what we're going to talk about today, documentarians don't have the opportunity to do, simply because you have the disguise of fiction, right? So I think of things in Barbados like Pampalam and Laugh It Off that satirize political power every single year. I think Pampalam has been going for 40 years or something Laugh It Off. And you'll find iterations of annual review shows like that all through the region. Of course, they're becoming less and less now, but I think that's probably because of some of the things that will come up in our talk today about the way in which advocacy and activism are becoming increasingly silent.
Yeah. I think many people who know about the work that I'm doing around government industrial school know that I started out as the deputy chair of the school. And I had not known a lot about what was happening in the school before, I took on that position. And about 2 years into my tenure, one of the things that always was very shocking to me was how little people actually knew about the government industrial school and what was happening there. And this got me interested more in documentary and media that people were actually interested in and going to, right? There is a way that a documentary can do far more than an esoteric academic essay. I realized that I could write a million essays about what was happening at the government industrial school as an academic and still not reach an audience. Talk me through the process then of creating a documentary on a subject like government industrial school and how you are able to bridge the gap between academic knowledge, and that kind of thing, but also just appealing more to the public.
Yeah, there's I think documentaries occur in a variety of forms, and I think where we are now in our media landscape with social media, we are not really thinking about documentary practice as a singular media stream, but rather as perhaps a singular media source that streams out onto multiple platforms. And so you're not thinking about this kind of logical timeline of, here's the beginning and this is the exposition, but you're engaging in a more what some theorists call a transmedia approach, where you are engaging with the audience from several directions at the same time. But traditionally, documentary was really just that, is that you set up the camera and observe. But very quickly, filmmakers and film theorists, once they started to investigate the impact of edited images on human perception, documentary started to evolve. And what started to take place was this notion that documentary was not neutral, that documentary was inevitably biased, whether it was biased based on the filmmaker's perspective or based on the entity that was funding the documentary. So the very notion of truth or in representation in documentary became a big question very early on. And so what that opened up was an opportunity to be idiosyncratic and very individual in the documentary voice. So, you know, I mean, we still see documentaries that operate on a more expository kind of platform where, you know, you have this voiceover that is telling you these are the facts, right? And then there are other types of documentaries that are a lot more comfortable with leaving the question of the factual nature of the images presented up to the audience, you know. So those are the kind of two polarities. And then, you know, between there are, you know, multiple approaches. But I think with something like what is occurring with the girls' industrial school, that the facts become incredibly important. And so this is where, you know, if I'm understanding your question correctly, is that there's a bridge between, you know, art and academia. And I think it is really about a relationship between factual information and something that will be, for want of a better term, entertaining enough to capture the attention of an audience that would not normally engage with the subject matter.
Absolutely. And I think that's why, and I think, you know, again, like we've said before, historically and culturally, Caribbean people like storytelling. Caribbean, there's a way in which, like you said, you know, the calypso tents and that kind of thing, that is where we go to have our discussion, right?
Correct.
So when I think of people like Tajay Henry, and people who articulate very clearly that Caribbean philosophy is embedded, right, in our dance and in our music. And I think that is why I'm so fascinated about documentary and what we are hopefully going to create around the government industrial school.
Right.
But even as we think about doing that now, and this was the part that you were very helpful in making me focus on, the law around that and just some of the things that we're going to have to surmount to be able to do the work that we want to do.
Yeah.
Tell me some reflections about the law.
So yeah, I think this is a great concern because, you know, well before our current digital moment, there was an issue with defamation laws, right? And the kind of broadness with which those laws could be applied. And so you have, you know, laws that are in Barbados, for example, with regard to stage presentations. I started out in theater, and one of the things that we had to deal with early on was the fact that you are not allowed legally to represent a police officer on stage. You can't dress a character as a police officer. So it means then that if you're trying to make a piece that has any sort of, you know, not even necessarily critical perspective on the police, but it could be complimentary, is that you don't have the opportunity to even represent their personage, which immediately draws up some red flags and offers up problems for public analysis, right, of a figure like that. But now with our current digital moment, what we are really confronting is the broadness with which the cybercrime and communication laws are being shaped. I am not a legal expert, so I wouldn't go as, you know, I can't go as deeply into it as I think we will need to in our process. And this is why I, you know, have strongly recommended to you that, you know, you get a legal support team on your side, is that it's from the conversations that I've had with lawyers and journalists about this issue in particular, it seems that the application of laws and the ability to charge someone with libel or harassment or defamation is pretty broad, you know, and it really does boil down once again, as in some ways it should, to one's ability to prove your facts, right? But I think this is where, art in the public space versus activism in the courtroom start to separate, is that, the thing about the girls' industrial school is that, everybody knows, you know what I mean? Everybody knows.
Yeah.
And so what we don't have is a collective confirmation of what we know, which is what art can do. So art does that, and it opens itself up to the aggression of the law. But what it does as an activist, as a transgressive act, is that it makes this knowledge publicly, collectively acceptable, right? And so it then puts the burden on the person being accused or the entity being accused to defend themselves. But if we wait for those kinds of activist moments to occur in the courtroom, well, our court system is laborious in the least, right? So something that is as urgent as the subject matter that you're engaging with, there are big questions about whether the court is the right place to begin this journey of public awareness and public action. So I think, yes, you are making the right choice of engaging with an art practice as your output for this. Beyond your academic work, that you're finding a way that it becomes more accessible to the public. But just, as I said, keeping in mind that, legally we are walking a very tight rope, and we just want to make sure that we're sure about it.
It's so interesting, that point you make about, taking what we all know collectively, but giving it a very public gaze. Because when I chose to whistleblow on the naked girl in the cell, my way of putting it, and it was a phrase that somebody had used to describe Andy I when we lost her in Guyana. It was said that Andy I was just the conscience of Guyana.
Right.
And when I whistleblew, I was like, I'm going to the national conscience. I'm going to the public, so that enough people can say that this is wrong for it to stop. Because I had tried, many other ways of doing that before then. So it's just interesting when you talked about that. It really... Yeah,
and I think, I'm glad you bring up Guyana, because Guyana, in its difficult years, not that its time has become, significantly less burdened, but in its, recognizably difficult political years, there were artists there with very strong backbones, right, that had an immense courage to speak up. And I think this is where, we are challenged right now in finding that courage, in one way, because I think, especially during that immediate post-independence period in the Caribbean, I think the sense was that the powers that you were pushing against were foreign powers. It was the legacy of colonialism. And whereas in our current moment, we are really pushing against ourselves, right? And so the conversation becomes a lot more difficult. It's like the difference between cursing out your neighbor and cursing out your sister.
Absolutely.
Right? But I do believe, like you said, is that there is a public conscience, and that the public conscience, once it is engaged and informed, will act. And this is where, and we've seen it over and over. One of my favorite people is the mighty Gabby, right? And it's interesting to me that Gabby has become a cultural ambassador for the country, because when I was growing up, every single year Gabby would get banned every single year, right? And his songs did have very significant public impact, right? One of his more famous songs is That Beach Is Mine, right? When there was this attempt to change the policy around beach access for the public. Yeah. And he sang this song and brought the issue into the public consciousness. And therefore, there was no politician that could play their political game and stand on that side of the fence. Absolutely. And so he, So
Great.
yeah, so
And it,
it is a question of that kind of courage and faith in the public conscience, I think.
absolutely. And it's so interesting because the last question I'm going to ask you now is about possibilities of art and activism and art activism in the Caribbean. And so it's interesting that you invoked Gabby just there. What do you think are the possibilities, Russell? Where are we going?
Well, I mean, you know, where media is going is, I mean, it is moving so quickly right now. In terms of the types of platforms that we have, the types of interface that we have, and as well the type of restrictions that we have. One of the most, I think, concerning issues that we have with the technology is bandwidth, right? We kind of assume that everybody has access to the internet, but they don't. Right. I mean, I was in school when this whole digital revolution, you know, really started to kick up dust. And, you know, even back then, the conversation was about the digital divide, right? And what we were going to observe sociologically as a result of this difference in the degree of access. So while something like this could get out there, the question of where it is going to get to, as well as the laws that govern its ability to move through the internet. There's also this idea that the internet is a quote unquote free space, and it is not. It is hyper curated, right? Of course, the visibility of that curation has become more and more visible in the last couple of years. So people don't really lean into that as much. But I think even in terms of, you know, the business community, when they think about, you know, internet marketing, you know, the assumption is, well, if I put it on the internet, people are going to see it. And it's like, no, you know, you have to really have this back end strategy with affecting the algorithms to make sure that your media is seen. So I am hopeful in one sense, because what social media does provide is that it provides independent distribution in a way that I don't think we have ever seen before. And it is as transformative as the Gutenberg press and as, you know, the Eastman Kodak box camera, and how that changed the way we transmit information. But I'm also, as I said, you know, very, very concerned about the legal framework in which these technologies exist. And you know, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an artist, right? I engage with the law, but that's not my area. And it is concerning to me that I'm not hearing more engagement from the legal fraternity on this issue.
Russell, I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule to have what I think is a very important conversation with me. I want to also thank Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard and Sapia and the entire RCYP organizing committee for allowing us this small space. And I now take the opportunity to open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marsha Hines Murray and Mr. Russell Watson, for allowing us the opportunity to see how important it is for different fields to intersect. And I really do appreciate the way that you showed us how art advocacy is important, right? So basically you guys combined your interests, and I really do appreciate seeing things from that perspective. So the floor is open for anyone who have any questions that they want to ask or, you know, get answered. So far, we only have one comment from Marlene Hope, who stated that, you know, referring to the point you made along the lines of Mr. Gabi singing government boots. So let's just wait a few seconds and see if we have any other questions. And in the meantime, Mr. Watson, would you like to say a few words in addition to what was already said?
No, I'm not sure if Marsha has managed to be with us today, but just to say that this project, her project is at a very, very early stage. We haven't fully committed to the documentary process yet, and that these legal questions are very much what is going to determine how we move forward into our next steps.
All right, thank you very much for your input. I'll just leave a few seconds, maybe a minute, for any comment. Anyone has anything to say, please raise your hands or put it in the comment section and we'll get it answered. All right, so I'm not seeing any comments or questions. So I guess it's safe to say that we can conclude this session a bit earlier. I do want to appreciate you, Mr. Watson, for being here with us today. I know that Dr. Hines Murray would have liked to be with us, but I do appreciate the input that she still left in the form of the video that we viewed. So this concludes the early end of this session. Our next session should be starting roughly around 2 p.m. Take care, everyone.
Welcome everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's fourth session, which I believe is our last panel, although we do have another event following this panel entitled Education Systems, Practices, and Child Rights Issues in Central America and the Caribbean. I would like to thank first and foremost, the University of the West Indies and Sally Says for hosting, with special thanks to Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard and Ms. Safia King for this invitation. It's an honor to be here with all of you today, chairing the session. So with that being said, we're going to proceed with our first presentation. I would like to invite Danielle Sanchez Morales, Kristen Swart, and Patricia Kwan to please turn on your cameras. They will be leading our first presentation entitled Spaces, Placemaking, and Ethnicity, the Experiences of Latin American Children in Canada's Education System. So just a little bit about our first presenters. Daniel Sanchez Morales completed his Bachelor of Science honors in psychology with a focus in neuropsychology at York University. He works as an undergraduate research assistant for the RCYP project, focusing mainly on the child protection system in El Salvador and experiences of migration in Canada. His research interests range from topics on the brain and behavior, social dynamics and systems, the impact of social structures and social mobility, socioeconomic context, and brain adaptation, among others. Kristen Swart has a Master's of Social Work degree specializing in social justice and diversity from the University of Toronto. Kristen's professional practice includes engaging with social issues surrounding gender-based violence, child protection, and human rights. Kristen's work has taken her across and the nonprofit sector. Her most recent research with the RCYP focuses on the intersections of the child protection and immigration systems, as well as how youth use social media to engage with issues related to human rights, immigration, and migration. And lastly, we have Patricia Kwan. Patricia is currently an MSW student at the Factor in Wintesh Faculty of Social Work at the University of Toronto. She is interested in structural barriers faced by international students and temporary workers, anti-Asian racism, community organizing, and community-based research. Her master thesis is about a case study of Chinese international student-led campus advocacy. She is currently completing her second practicum at the Rights for Children and Youth Partnership Project at Toronto Metropolitan University. So with that, I will give you all the floor.
Oh, thank you. Let me just share my screen. 1 second. Perfect. I think that, can everybody see the screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, cool.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. Thank you, Veronica, for the introduction. Hello, my name is Kristen Sward, and I'm excited to be presenting today with my colleagues, Patricia Kwan and Daniel Sanchez Morales. We would also like to acknowledge the principal investigator, Dr. Henry Parada, and research coordinator, Veronica Escobar Olivo, who are involved in the data collection and analysis. And we're part of the larger RCYP project and are based in Toronto, Canada. And we would also like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to address today's audience and the youth that were involved in the research for sharing their stories. Our presentation spaces placemaking and ethnicity, the experiences of Latin American children in Canada's education system, reports on the preliminary findings of the research study on the experiences of Latin American youth as they navigate Ontario's education system. Our presentation will be divided into 5 sections. We will first begin by discussing the focus of the research and then move on to discussing the conceptual framework and the methodology, move towards the findings and implications, and end with some conclusions about the summaries of what we've talked about. The research asks, what do placemaking and belonging look like for youth within the Latin American community of Southern Ontario? When we're speaking about youth, we are referring to people between the ages of 16 to 26. And as part of the presentation, we will speak about Latin American youth using the words they chose to self-identify as to honor their individuality. We are referring to the same community, but we will use identifiers such as Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish. And I now invite Patricia to the conversation to introduce placemaking and explain the conceptual framework.
Thank you. This study used a constructivist grounded theory to explore placemaking for Latin Americans in Canada. This theory allows us to explore the how and the what of the study, so the data examined is conceptualized to the specific context. There has been a multitude of research exploring the concept of placemaking, which is generally defined as the process during which people transform place from where they find themselves in to where they live, where there's a cultural significance, belonging, and it reflects the community's agency. It also implies ascribing new meanings to the already existing space and constructing new narratives that run counter to the mainstream ones told by the regulating bodies. There has been research exploring the placemaking of immigrant communities, both in the States and Canada. They mainly argue that changing either the physical presence of the place or the storytelling associated with it can help people generate new narratives, which is central to the practice of placemaking. There has also been research focusing on placemaking of the Latin American community in the United States. However, little work has been done for this population in the context of Canada. And we do have to point out that the difference between the two contexts is quite significant. For example, in the States, there are Latin American communities spawned by geographical locations, and there are Latin American stores that anchors the community. However, similar circumstances has not been detected in Canada, where this population is much more invisible. Lastly, there are also studies on youth placemaking. However, again, little work has been done for the Latin American youth specifically. As such, the present work seeks to explore the root of the analysis in the Canadian context, taking note of the complexity of their worldviews and experience, and centering the youth's belief, values, and ideas of our participants. And now I'll be passing on to Daniel to talk about the methodology and findings of the study.
Perfect. So for study participants in this study were recruited making use of purposeful and snowball sampling techniques and the data collection took place during the periods of October 2018 to April 2020. Central American and Dominican youth were the central focus of the research. However, youth that identified as Latin American were not excluded from participating. It was possible to collect a total of 37 individual interviews and 2 focus groups, with a total of 23 participants between both groups. And these interviews were focused on the experiences of Latin American youth navigating the Ontario's education system. So for our funding section, from the interviews, we identified 3 main predominant themes for preliminary findings: the lack of visual representation, attempts maintaining meaningful connections, and cultural ambiguity and questioning. Before jumping into our findings, we would like to mention that we proceed to use pseudonyms in the presentation to guarantee confidentiality of the participants in our study. So for the first section, I would like to invite Patricia again.
Thank you. The first main thing is the lack of visual representation of Latin American students in school. Like in this quote, Adrian noticed that people from the same culture tend to form subgroups within the school, but there weren't a lot of their people, aka other Latin American students. So they also expressed the desire to be transferred to another school where there will be more people from their background. Similarly, in the next slide, Laura also noticed that there weren't any Black people and were only 3 Latin American students in their school. So the lack of visual representation of Latin Americans in schools hinders our students' ability to form a community, and thus it also impacts their sense of belonging and connection, because it is hard for people to form a community and feel comfortable in a place where there are not many people there to form this community with. And I will be passing back on to Daniel.
Perfect. So moving to attempts to maintain meaningful connections, just highlight how evident cultural expressions, behaviors, or actions limited the interactions they had with peers. As they shared, cultural differences framed the level of interaction Latinx youth had with other youth, and how this cultural shock pushed them to find alternative ways to establish connections with others. For example, Luisa shared an encounter of cultural shaming in a school in the following quote. We became friends, but it was a different culture. I was the extra Spanish girl. I will come up to them and kiss them on the cheek, like, hi. That's like I'm being polite. They're like, no, we don't do that here. So it was a big culture shock. The way they speak, the things they are into. As presented, there is an effort by Latinx youth to be open and share their cultural identity and vulnerability. Nevertheless, youth often report how there is a constant rejection or lack of openness by other peers, making the process of building meaningful connections more challenging. As a result, Latinx youth that did not have the opportunity to establish relationships with other Latinx mentioned how they saw themselves forced to merge with the predominant visible culture in their spaces, and thus either deny or hiding their cultural identity. So moving on to the next quote. We have that the frustration in the process of making connections then places Latinx youth on a limbo. In the case of in the case of immigrant youth, as Lorena expressed in this quote, there's a confusion about leaving connections from the country of origin behind, and there's a denial about start rooting on some friendships or relationships in the new environment. This often limits the ability to connect with others. As Lorena emphasizes, I was such in denial. I was like, I don't need friends. I have my friends from back home. You are in that stage. I didn't really have the need to make friends, but sometimes I would. So that was when it was bad. Then it was great. But then I was like, they're gonna leave me and I'm gonna stay here by myself. However, once there is enough confidence to start connecting with others, there is a constant fear that this connection will not last long enough. To put it into perspective, immigrant youth are in constant physical or spatial movement, meaning that settling in a specific physical space is challenging. Therefore, there is a sense of instability when building or maintaining connections, and a persistent fear of losing those connections due to displacement. With this, it is hard to build a sense of belonging since it is difficult to establish a stable or representative network. And finally, we have to conclude this section, Pedro explains how the process of attempting to maintain connections is an emotional demanding process, as he shares. I have a friend who I spent lunch with at the beginning of high school. At the end of the semester, she had to move to Ottawa, and well, that was horrible because I had just had an experience like that. I had just left my friends, and the only person I was beginning to trust in, I have a good relationship, lives. Often Latin American youth go through the cycle of displacement that starts by first changing a physical space, often due to immigration processes or housing relocation. Second, figuring out how to approach other peers in the new space. Third, attempting to connect and maintain those relationships. And finally, losing those relationships again due to external factors, such as displacing or moving out to a new area, which is unfortunate. As presented by Pedro, there is a constant fear of abandonment by others, and this can turn into constant distress or feelings of anxiety. This cycle limits the capability of building a sense of belonging and thus interferes with Latin American youth emotional and personal development. Not being able to keep up with these relationships evoke feelings of frustration and disappointment. So I would like to pass it to Kristen.
In our third theme, cultural ambiguity and questioning, cultural ambiguity can refer to a cultural identity not clearly defined by a certain region. Manuel described a situation when he was asked about a seemingly universal Canadian experience that his peers remembered. Through this interaction, Manuel realized the difference in his worldview and exposure compared to his peers. He felt his experience was not normal, implying he was different by saying, I lived a different life, not a normal life. Manuel's peers questioned if he was Canadian, implying that there is a tacit knowledge that must be shared to be considered Canadian. Luis spoke about visiting Nicaragua, where he felt out of place despite having family and historical ties to the area. Luis compared this feeling like he also does not fit into Canada, saying, I feel so out of place. It's confusing because I don't fit into either culture. He describes his cultural ambiguity as not knowing how to identify, both internally and with his family. Specifically, he spoke about how he wanted to fit in but felt caught between two places. Luis questioned his place and belonging, where his place and belonging were as he explored his identity. Despite her pride and cultural ties to her Latin American heritage, Carolina spoke about a time when she identified as Venezuelan but was told she was Canadian. Carolina alludes to the pressure she feels to assimilate and define herself in predetermined ways by saying, it's so easy to just lose yourself quickly in Canadian culture. However, she shares her hope that she can feel belonging to a new category or group and that she no longer feels othered, but accepted for her identity, which may be different from what people traditionally think of as the Canadian norm. Youth feel caught in the middle of two experiences, identifying as Canadian while wanting to maintain their ties to their Latin American culture. This led to youth feeling out of place and unsure how to define themselves. Often the realization youth had occurred when they compared themselves to their peers who had different worldviews. Youth expressed their desire to have relationships with other Latin American youth and maintain friendships, seemingly so they felt welcomed, emotionally safe, and understood. The youth implied that being in the same physical environment as friends and family did not diminish the quality of their relationships, but changed their perception of self and belonging when they didn't have the visual representations of other Latin American youth. Adolescence, a time that is often defined by exploring identity and belonging, is disproportionately more challenging for Latin American youth when they don't feel like they have a safe place or people where they feel comfortable, visible, and valued for their Latin American heritage.
So to go super quick on our conclusions, first, through the interviews, we identify how inclusion does not always equal belonging or genuine connection. As youth described, in spaces with predominantly not Latinx youth, it was difficult to establish genuine relationships, which consequently made them feel like outsiders. Not being able to share their culture in a safe space creates resistance to start a process of self-identification in a specific geographic location, and thus a sense of belonging is automatically denied. For youth that are constantly changing geographical spaces, the lack of stability makes it challenging to recognize a space as a place to root for their cultural heritage, giving as a result the necessity to hide their Latin American background to fit in a different predominant group. This is connected to our second point on how social connectedness is directly linked into psychological well-being. As many Latinx youth express, the inability to maintain a stable social network negatively impacts their mental health. There is a constant fear of abandonment or fear of others to live their life, which poses a barrier when it comes to start rooting for new relationships. For Latinx youth who had the opportunity to connect with their Latin American heritage back in their Latin American countries, it is also noticeable how the perception of otherness or outsider impacts their ability to connect with both their social network and culture, which consequently evokes feelings of frustration and confusion. Patricia.
Okay, thank you. So the third point is that the youth we interviewed lacked a sense of stability and had very limited connections, even when they tried to establish themselves and build relationships. There's also definitely a need for safe places and the acknowledgement of a visible Latin American space that uses a decolonized approach, so the segregation and colonialism is not further perpetuated in our communities. Thank you. That's all for our presentation. I'll be passing back to Kristen.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for engaging in our research today. We look forward to hearing your comments and questions. And if anyone has questions after today, please connect with us. We've listed our contact information on this slide. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel, Kristen, and Patricia for that very interesting presentation. Just a reminder to our audience that you can input your questions either using the Q&A function or the chat function. And also a reminder to our speakers to please speak slowly so that our interpreters are able to catch everything and translate. So with that being said, I would like to invite our next three presenters, Laura Perez Gonzalez, Brenda Aleman, and Jasmine Murphy, who will be presenting Suddenly I Was Shy, Latin American 1.5 Generation and Identity Building. So to share a little bit about our presenters, Laura completed a master's in international development studies that focused on non-formal education in the Caribbean. She has over 5 years of experience conducting research and leading education and gender-focused programs with communities in Canada, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. Her research focuses on education, immigration, women's empowerment, and their intersectionalities in the experiences of youth. As a research assistant in the Rights for Children and Youth Partnership, she has co-written articles on the experiences of immigrant Latin American and Caribbean parents as they navigate Ontario's education system. Brenda is currently a fourth-year Bachelor of Arts student in psychology at Toronto Metropolitan University. She is currently a research assistant with the RCYP project, and as a first-generation Latin American in Canada, she is passionate about the experiences of navigation in the multiple systems and of the experiences of both immigrant youth and families. She has a keen interest in the stigma and experiences of mental health within immigrant youth and their families. And lastly, we have Jasmine, who is a fourth-year student at Ontario Tech University, currently studying forensic psychology with a minor in criminology. She hopes to further her education after graduation by attending graduate school with the end goal of becoming a clinical psychologist. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Laura, Brenda, and Jasmine.
Hello, everybody. Are you able to see my screen okay? Okay. My name is Jasmine, and these are my colleagues Laura and Brenda, who will be presenting with me today, as well as Veronica Escobar-Olivio and Dr. Henry Prada, who were essential in the research collection. We are part of the RCYP project, and we would like to welcome you all to today's conference session. I'd also like to give a big thank you to the organizers, UWI and TMU, as well as all of you for joining us. Today, we will be sharing our presentation, Suddenly I Was Shy, Latin American 1.5 Generation and Identity Building. Our presentation examines and explores experiences of 1.5 generation Latin American students in the Ontario education system. We will be discussing prevalent themes and ideas we have found in order to explain this topic to you in more depth. I will now hand it off to Laura so she can explain a bit more about our research.
Thank you, Jasmine. So our presentation examines the experiences of 1.5 generation Latin American students in the Ontario education system. We aim to highlight some of the complexities of belonging that these youth experienced as they navigate identity building. The term 1.5 generation is used to describe those who have arrived to the current country of residence as children. It has been recognized by scholars that youth in this generational cohort are often exposed to a sense of in-betweenness when they're trying to adapt and settle to a new social cultural environment in a way that also differs from first and second generations. Given that their unique circumstance of being neither from here or there, the literature recognizes that there is a struggle to find a sense of belonging. To understand the intersections of racialized and immigrant identities within a Euro-Canadian education system, we looked at the literature that demonstrates how discriminatory frameworks are embedded in Ontario's education system and how it negatively impacts racialized youth, their opportunities, and their interactions with peers and educators. Research has explored the experiences of racism in educational settings and suggests that students feel like they don't belong. Studies have also examined high dropout rates amongst Latin American students, noting that they're overrepresented in special needs identification numbers in comparison to their other peers, and also the expression by Latin American youth of being arbitrarily placed in ESL or English as a second language course. And youth also in the study have highlighted the difficulties of trying to belong and fit in at school while also struggling to hold on to their cultural values and their sense of self. So with that, in our study, we did use critical race theory and Latino critical theory. To start off with critical race theory, according to Delgado and Stefanchik, critical race helps to explore the systemic and permanent nature of racism. So in Canada, pervading discourses of multiculturalism remain rooted in racial assumptions that are essential to defining and enforcing boundaries of belonging. Critical race theory helps us challenge prevailing views of fairness, meritocracy, colorblindness, and neutrality in the realities of education for racial minorities. Through CRT, we explored systemic ways in which narratives of identity and belonging in Canadian society have invisibilized the different experiences of 1.5 generation Latin American youth. We also refer to Latino critical theory, or LatCrit, to further delve into this experience. Okay, I'll slow down a bit more, sorry. To further delve into the experience, as it does provide a framework to recognize the racialization that Latin American communities face, with particular attention to immigration, language, culture, ethnicity, and multi-identities. In effect, LatCrit emphasizes the importance of analyzing identity constructions as a group and at the individual level. So for our methodology, we use a narrative framework to analyze the experience of Latin American youth in the Ontario education system. Our research process seeks to explore individuals' understanding of their experience in the context of their everyday lives, while also looking to the wider social and cultural context in which people draw to help them make sense of their lives and their sense of self. The framework served as a tool for attributing meaning to personal stories of participants and recognized that these stories represent constructed and reconstructed experiences based on how individuals make sense of their own realities. So narratives therefore helped us examine youth's experiences in education systems while also considering wider sociocultural context and practices. Our findings were based on 16, next slide. Our findings were based on 16 semi-structured interviews and 2 focus groups with 23 Latin American youth who identified as belonging to 1.5 generation in Canada. Although the study did focus on the diasporas from the countries of the project, including El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic, all Latin American youth who were interested in participating were welcomed.
Amongst the research, we found multiple important themes. The three main themes we took note of include acculturation process, experiences of unbelonging, and the impact on identity formation. We explored these in more depth and used them to guide the direction of our presentation. I'll now pass it back to Laura so she can explain the acculturation process.
So to provide initial context, the 1.5 generation youth in our study expressed difference between schooling and their country of origin in contrast to the Ontario education system. Many referred to difficulties in adapting to new curriculums, feeling they were already ahead of their peers, but struggled to situate themselves amongst established social relations that had taken place within the school. Language played a key role for many reasons. Although participants recognized they were able to understand concepts and lessons, communicating and expressing themselves was a challenge that affected how they eased into their new learning environments. As one youth stated, it was hard because it's a whole new system. It's a whole new language. With English, I understood everything when I came here. The only problem was speaking and answering back to people. So in addition to navigating a new system and social relations, youth in this study described being made to feel different based on their accent. Participants described their accent had direct implications on their learning, and their teachers assumed as they were unable to understand what was going on in the classroom and to ultimately speak fluent English. Despite understanding perfectly, Latin American youth were singled out by their peers and by educators for failing to integrate into English proficiency standards. I started to develop an accent because my parents had an accent, but my teachers recommended I do ESL. They thought I was having trouble speaking, but I wasn't having trouble speaking. They were like, you do not understand. You have to be speaking English more fluently. Realizing outcomes of having an accent, youth sought ways to hide it, and some worked towards getting rid of it entirely to avoid being seen as a weird person. I really didn't have much of an accent because I'd watch a lot of TV and practice speaking. My accent kind of left me. I was able to be a whole new person. I wasn't that weird ESL person that went to a different classroom. As this participant described, eliminating their accent enabled them to become a whole new person. In effect, language and having an accent symbolized a marker of difference, and youth described it made them feel excluded and outcasted. And lastly, for this section, due to language being described as a barrier for 1.5 generation youth and their involvement in school, many began to feel pressures related to not belonging amongst their peers, which had an impact on their self-esteem and ties to not being Canadian like the other students. One pointed out that maybe it was an issue not being born in Canada, because maybe their English wasn't the best. They couldn't understand most things what students were also saying. Struggling to find their sense of self in the classroom and to communicate in ways that were perceived as speaking and understanding English well, youth began to notice a shift in their personalities. Another youth described, I was very shy and I don't like asking for help. So I struggled a lot in school and I didn't know who to reach out to. The sentiments of not being able to ask for help ultimately began affecting their ability to engage in schools in ways that were deemed appropriate, in ways that they were able to fit in with their peers, and in ways that enabled access to resources due to perceptions of their abilities that were limited as influenced and imposed by school systems themselves. And I'll pass it over to Jasmine.
So a common factor that seemingly affected the feeling of unbelonging among the Latin American youth was their accent. The Latin American youth that had been interviewed all had different stories and experiences, but similar sentiments on how they felt their accents made them stand out or made them self-conscious. I've had this fear that I'm scared of my accent. I'm very shy about my accent, that they'll judge me. I'm shy about opening myself up to someone and they hear my accent. This youth explained having a fear of their accent, showing that they viewed their accent as a roadblock to making friends and causing them to retreat into themselves and become more shy. I think they'll exclude me because I'm not like them. I wish I could talk like that with that accent. The feeling of exclusion also stemmed from the fear of their accents. They viewed it as a marker of their differences that had led them to being left out, further fueling that sense of unbelonging. Not only were the youth internalizing the belief that their accent would lead to them being excluded or made fun of, but the actions of the other children were reinforcing that idea. One Latin American youth stated, because you have an accent or don't have good English, they forget they're talking to you. Whether the other children realized that this was something they were doing or not, their actions perpetuated a notion that accents are something to be ashamed or embarrassed of. I had a stronger accent before. I would speak and they would laugh. Again, this behavior reinforces negative stereotypes as well as the internalized fear of being different and standing out in a negative way. Whether it's walking away mid-conversation or laughing at a child for their accent, the behavior can feed into negative beliefs and perpetuate harmful ideals that can be damaging to self-esteem and beliefs. And I will now pass it to Brenda so she can discuss the impact on identity formation.
Thank you, Jasmine. So the formation of identity in youth was influenced by the way they spoke the language. Latin American youth reported that perpetuated harmful ideals affected their ability to engage in school as it damaged their self-image and their sense of identity. These ideas were things that they described as their Latin American community being seen as a small thing. Although the level of study is described as harder compared to the education they received in Canada, they felt that their community should be given a lot more credit. Youth reported that they felt excluded regarding their place within social and systemic structures and settings. These feelings were reported more often by youth when they had a noticeable accent or less than proficient English. They felt that this impacted their sense of self-identity. You don't know a language, you don't know these people, describing it as a feeling like a fish out of water. Just a weird place to be and not being able to understand their own feelings at the time, which left youth feeling uncomfortable and weird. The pressures and differences that youth perceived in their social settings affected their ability to engage with other peers and educators, as well as their ability to adapt and navigate the education system due to feelings of marginalization perpetuated either through noticeable differences in language or feelings of discomfort. A common theme reported by youth was a dissonance between their cultural ideals and identity, which language plays a great role in. Youth felt that language formed a great part of their identity. One youth mentioned that she started forgetting her Spanish. She mentioned that it was just nice to have friends who would understand her in Spanish so that she could practice with them. In regards to having Spanish-speaking peers in the school setting, youth described feeling stuck in between who they were before, who they were at the time, and who they feel they needed to be as they adapted to a new environment. As we see here, one youth describes it as being able to say many things, many words, and that people wouldn't care. But they described it as, here, I'm scared, as someone may get really upset, describing it as super different and that adapting was super difficult. Acclimating to a new environment often left youth feeling as if they were removing a piece of themselves and attributed to a negative sense of self as they reported feelings of having to change the way they spoke and how they spoke to others in conversations. As we can see, youth often reported that they tended to lose themselves as they changed their habits in an attempt to better adapt to their new social environments, stating that they were a bit more social back home. It was the first time for them as it was the first time that they were faced with the unknown and having to think about what it means to get hurt or have someone being mean to them. Latin American youth felt forced to merge their identity within the dominant culture as an attempt to be accepted by their peers and educators. Another youth describes becoming shy as they were extroverted in Colombia and talking with everyone that it didn't matter to them. However, when they arrived to Canada, their demeanor changed and they became shy, becoming more timid. These instances showcase the feelings of fear Latin American youth had when they discussed maintaining their self-identities held in their home countries and in the creation of new ones, as well as the desire they held for making a place for themselves in a new environment. Youth in the study described feeling that their proficiency and pronunciation of the English language overshadowed them as a person and was an obstacle in their ability to engage with peers and educators. The discussions and conclusions gathered from the data that Latin American youth reported were as follows. Adapting to a new environment is complex for 1.5 generation youth due to feelings of unbelonging and discriminatory frameworks embedded in the Ontario school system. Social and systemic support that schools provided for youth felt inadequate in addressing personal and cultural concerns, especially as youth were forced to balance a sense of in-betweenness in order to try to fit in and communicate without letting go entirely of their cultural identity and Spanish speaking. Youth encountered discrimination based on their accents and marked differences. As a result, youth reported that they felt fearful, inferior, and insecure about their Latin American identity. Discriminatory perspectives of Latin American youth and their communities have negatively influenced youth self-perceptions and opportunities to access resources equitably in the education system. Social and systemic pressures influence feelings of exclusion and marginalization within their peers and communities, affecting education and career prospects. And we would like to thank everyone for your attention, and we look forward to your questions. Please also feel free to contact any of us by email. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura, Brenda, and Jasmine for that presentation. So next we have Dr. James.
Gracias a Laura, Brenda y Jasmine por esta presentación. Ahora.
Sorry that I heard the interpretation at the same time. Now we would like to invite Dr. Jameson Charles, who will be presenting the roles of schools as safe spaces to protect the rights and well-being of students, perspectives of teachers in selected secondary schools in Trinidad. And I would also like to acknowledge her non-presenting authors, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard and Safia King. So to share a little bit about Dr. Jameson Charles. Dr. Jameson Charles has been an educator for 42 years. She worked as a common entrance teacher and guidance counselor at the Entrepot Secondary School, Castries, St. Lucia. She is presently employed as a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. She is the holder of a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology, a Master of Education, Education for Employment, and a PhD in Education, Learning, and Instruction in Higher Education. She is a trained counselor and has received training in individual and group counseling, focusing on psychodrama and play therapy. Her research interests are teacher education and professional development, high stakes testing, youth development, empowerment and development, education for employment, making transitions, organizational development, and learning and instruction in higher education. Dr. Jameson Charles, I would like to give you the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to share our research. Our presentation today, we look at the roles of schools as safe spaces to protect the rights and well-being of students. So we're looking at the perspectives of teachers in selected secondary schools in Trinidad. So one of the things that we look at from a school standpoint, we look at the school as a critical institution that prepares children for society, and what they do is also the holistic development of the child is enhanced. It's supposed to be enhanced, and that's what the World WHO speaks to. So I'm going to look at our presentation will focus on the school as a health promoting status schools. So the discourse on health promoting school looks at school as nurturing environments. Students' rights and well-being are protected and also enhanced. So the rights of the child, so when you talk about the child rights and well-being, these are two critical factors that we as educators or as policymakers need to understand in terms of ensuring that the child is a fully functioning human being and can make a contribution to society. So when we speak from a health promoting school, we look at schools not just a place for academic achievement, but support. Okay, where for some children, the school is the first place where they experience society and they have a lot of experiences and so on. And I listened to the previous presenters who spoke about how children are fared in schools because of the accents and so on and so forth. So that speaks to whether the school is health promoting. So we look at the critical role from a positive development standpoint when we're talking about health promoting schools. So for this presentation, what we, the team, our purpose was to present the teacher's perspectives on the perceptions of the rights of the child. So what we really wanted to capture in that presentation is to see what teachers think about the school, the role of the school as a safe space. And you know, the discourse on safe spaces speaks to children could be in a place where there's non-judgmental, where they feel safe and they feel secure. So what is this role of the school as a safe space to promote the well-being of children? So our research question spoke to the secondary school teachers, how they describe their role in facilitating the child's rights and well-being. We also look at what are the challenges that they encountered in their thrust towards facilitating the child's rights and well-being. And we also look at some of the recommendations that may have emerged from the data. So we argue that the institutional practices and relationships that school can potentially facilitate improvements in the rights and well-being of students, especially given that risk associated with such practices and relationships can also hinder prospects of improving children's rights and well-being. And we also argue then that teachers are the first responders for students, and therefore they can articulate the issues in the teaching and learning environment that facilitate health performance. So we had an exploratory qualitative research design, and we look at this. We try to investigate the school's role as a safe space, and then so the research team, we conducted about 6 interviews which focused on teachers and parents. But for the purpose of this presentation, we only looked at the teachers' responses. We also only interrogated the teachers' data. Okay, so we used the Zoom platform was used because of what you call it, COVID and so on. We went through the ethics issues, and then we had the interviews, and then we transcribed the recordings and so on. We used a thematic analysis to do whatever we had to for us to be able to get the vignettes, and also to get the themes that what we are looking for from that start. So given time, the time I don't have any vignettes written, but I could always speak to some of them for you. So in the when we analyzed and we interrogated the data, these are the major themes that emerged. 8 themes. Ambiguity in the conceptualization of child rights and well-being in schools, the perpetuation of inequity in the education system, limitations placed on holistic development of students due to
it appears that Dr. Jamison Charles's video has frozen. Perhaps we can give her a minute to see if she reconnects. Okay, so it appears Dr. Jamison Charles has disconnected. Why don't we proceed to the next presentation, and then we can invite Dr. Jamison Charles to continue once that presentation has finished. So I would like to invite Ana Luisa Reyes, who will be presenting Safeguarding Rights in Educational Centers, Study of Cases in the Dominican Republic. Hi, Anna. So just to introduce Anna, she is a research assistant at the Pontifical Catholic University of Mother and Teacher and a specialist in Montessori education with a degree in education and a specialization in Spanish language and social sciences. Anna has extensive experience in civic and citizen education and has co-authored the book Donne Fabuloso in 2021. So with that, Anna, the floor is yours.
Gracias. Gracias. Voy a estar compartiendo mi pantalla para presentar nuestra investigación. Ok. Aquí. Muy bien. Este proceso investigativo que nosotras realizamos lo titulamos Garantía de Derechos Humanos, Garantía de Derechos sobre todos, en centros educativos de la República Dominicana. Es más que nada un estudio de caso y vimos diferentes aspectos, entre ellos los derechos humanos dentro de las aulas y sobre todo con el grupo que fue entrevistado, los que participaron de las entrevistas. Estas entrevistas tuvieron varias etapas. Vimos también el acceso a una educación gratuita y de calidad que tienen los chicos en la República Dominicana. Vimos también el derecho a la educación sobre todo y este bienestar como estado de estabilidad mental, física y emocional. Nos pareció bastante importante definir antes que nada la palabra bienestar, el concepto bienestar, para poder comprender y trabajar con...
Sorry, my electricity it just went. So I don't know if you all want me to continue or so on. Or
Dr. James and Charles, we've gone ahead with the next presentation, but we'll have you continue once that one has completed.
So I will have to continue using my phone because I don't have electricity and it just went.
Okay. Perdón, Ana.
Ok. Esta en sí. A veces es tema de conectividad que pasan. Bueno, entonces nada, básicamente esto es una mirada general de los conceptos que estuvimos trabajando en esta investigación. Además, antes que nada, abordamos algunas reflexiones teóricas sobre la juventud. Juventud como fenómeno sociocultural, el enfoque funcionalista de la concepción de juventud, el enfoque biográfico como esta etapa transitoria por el que pasamos todos y todas, y pasan también nuestros jóvenes que están asistiendo a la escuela en esta etapa, y el enfoque sociocultural de cómo se aborda la juventud. Dentro también de las reflexiones teóricas, nosotros vimos el marco jurídico dominicano en materia de la juventud y nosotros tenemos dos grandes leyes que tienen que ver con la jurisdicción juvenil. El primero es el Código para el Sistema de Protección y los Derechos Fundamentales de los Niños, Niñas y Adolescentes. Esa es nuestra ley número 13603. Y la segunda es la Ley General de Juventud 4900. Básicamente esta es nuestra sombrilla legal que tienen los jóvenes. Es interesante también que dentro de la investigación reflexionamos de manera teórica sobre el adultocentrismo, esta diferencia de poder visible que puede existir entre las generaciones de adultos y jóvenes, que está básicamente fundamentada en la propiedad del saber y la experiencia acumulada, y los jóvenes vienen quedando en una condición de subordinación. Las representaciones dominantes sobre los jóvenes tienen a ser definidas entonces por el mundo adulto. Y conversamos además, dejamos bastante claro en la investigación sobre estas visiones adultas de lo que debe ser un joven. Les decía entonces que esta investigación tuvo varias etapas. Está básicamente diseñada a manera de etnografía institucional. La selección de los centros educativos fue intencionada. Los chicos que participaron en la investigación, primero sus padres firmaron un consentimiento informado de que iban a estar participando de esta investigación. Luego los mismos jóvenes firmaron su propio consentimiento de que estaban de acuerdo en participar. Y en una primera etapa tuvimos varios grupos focales, y en una segunda etapa los chicos pudieron tener crear una representación artística a partir de lo conversado en los grupos focales. Son básicamente entrevistas a profundidad, y es bueno saber que los datos fueron fueron recogidos entre febrero y abril del 2019. Es importante la fecha de selección del dato porque muy probablemente el contexto haya cambiado antes y luego de la pandemia, este tema de derechos humanos y de acceso a la calidad de la educación. Dentro de los hallazgos, nosotros pudimos observar que tanto los jóvenes como los padres y los profesionales tenían un conocimiento de sus derechos, de cuáles derechos les pertenecen como persona humana. Luego, sobre la educación, los estudiantes relacionan la educación con el aprendizaje, los padres relacionan el tema de la educación con los valores y el buen comportamiento en sociedad, y los profesionales relacionan la educación con la ciencia y la transversalidad de las asignaturas. Y es interesante que cada grupo de los participantes, y sobre todo los jóvenes, tienen una percepción distinta con respecto a la educación. Sobre el bienestar, los chicos dijeron que tiene que ver con cómo ellos se sentían seguros para el futuro. Los padres, madres o tutores no obtuvimos datos con respecto a su concepción de bienestar, y los profesionales lo relacionaron con el tema de una sociedad o un grupo de personas empobrecidas o enriquecidas. Además de esto que le vengo comentando, de las entrevistas realizadas a los jóvenes y esta triangulación que hicimos anteriormente con respecto a cómo van respondiendo los jóvenes, los padres y los profesionales, también hicimos una comparación entre lo que respondían los jóvenes de los centros públicos de excelencia rural, de las escuelas públicas urbanas, colegio privado, colegio nocturno rural y escuela técnica rural. Pues como la muestra fue intencionada, cada grupo focal tuvo un contexto distinto. Por ejemplo, los jóvenes que pertenecen al Centro Público de Excelencia Rural, cuando se le preguntó sobre la igualdad de derechos humanos, respondieron que todos ellos son iguales, pero que en práctica no se cumple esa igualdad de derechos. En cambio, los de las escuelas públicas regulares urbanas dijeron que los jóvenes tienen derecho, pero dependiendo del lugar donde se encuentren. En el tema del colegio privado, los chicos respondieron que ellos observaron que realmente todos tienen los derechos, pero estos derechos no se cumplen. En el caso del nocturno, del centro nocturno rural, que también es un centro público, respondieron como que a veces sí, a veces no. Y en la escuela técnica rural, en teoría sí, pero en la práctica no. Este tipo de respuesta la vamos a ver tanto para la educación, para su futuro, el tema de la educación que reciben para su futuro, y el tema de su bienestar. A manera general, se puede observar que los estudiantes de colegio privado van a tener un mayor conocimiento sobre el contexto y una mayor conceptualización de que las respuestas que nos daban los estudiantes de la escuela pública, sobre todo la escuela pública rural. A manera de conclusión, esta incidencia entre las posiciones de los jóvenes, padres, madres, tutores o profesionales van a tener importancia frente a su concepción de educación, de bienestar y de derechos humanos, aunque cada grupo va a tener una concepción distinta, que se entiende también que lo vean de una manera distinta. Es interesante ver desde qué punto lo ven cada uno. En el caso de los estudiantes de los centros privados, a manera de conclusión y casi viendo todas las respuestas, poseen mayores herramientas comunicativas, reflexivas, para comunicar lo que observan, para comunicar lo que sienten y para comunicar lo que piensan. Los estudiantes de los centros públicos, a diferencia, van a presentar retos para expresar una observación crítica con respecto a su entorno. Y nada, muchas gracias. Estamos aquí dispuestos para responder cualquier pregunta que tengan al respecto de esta investigación.
Muchísimas gracias, Ana. Muy interesante la presentación. I would like to take this opportunity to remind the audience that they are able to use the Q&A function and the chat function for any questions that they may have for any of the presentations. And I would also like to now invite Dr. Jameson Charles to resume her presentation.
I'm so sorry, everyone, that we have no electricity, but I'm going to be using my phone, so I'll not be able to share my screen, but I could speak to the presentation, to where I was in terms of presenting. So bear with me. I'm just going to go back a little bit from what we spoke, the eight themes that we got, the insights on the findings, where we got 8 major themes to talk about the ambiguity of in the conceptualization of children's rights and well-being. We look at the perpetuation of inequity. We look at behavioral issues at schools, limitations on the holistic development of students due to staff challenges. We look at the capacity building. We look at the influence of media and technology, and we look at we looked at support, and parental support, the influence and their behavior, and the learning disabilities and other learning challenges. These are some of the themes that came out of the findings in terms of the schools being a safe place, safe space. So in terms of the ambiguity in the conceptualization of the children's rights and well-being, there were a lot of variations in the teachers' perceptions regarding the children's rights and well-being. Several participants responded that the school's context did not clearly define a child's rights and well-being, and therefore it was difficult to determine how children's rights and well-being are highlighted in schools. There was a general consensus on the role of schools in supporting the well-being of children, is that if there are clear guidelines, for treating with the fact that children respond differently to the same stimuli in the education system, and thus the need for adequate resources to address such outcomes, so the rights and the well-being of the children would have been addressed. Another theme was the perception of inequity in the education system. The teachers were concerned about education for all, and they thought that the education system sought to promote child rights and well-being in theory. That was not manifested in the case in practice based on initiatives and activities. So the variation in teachers' responses were evident given the number of issues that they identify as not subscribing to child rights and well-being based on the assessment of the education system. They also look at the overemphasis on academic-oriented subjects at the expense of technical and vocational subjects. It was seen as an impediment to the holistic development of a child and thus compromise their rights. So in terms of the limitations placed on the holistic development of students due to school and staff challenges, so what the teachers did, they acknowledged that students have strengths that must be harnessed. Each student had unique skills, talents, and abilities. The school is poised to ensure that students can develop their talents so that they can thrive. However, the teachers lamented that recent modifications of the curriculum left some children even unable to read. The teachers were worried that students had to compete with others from high-performing schools, while those who were struggling academically had to compete using the same curriculum. Okay, so the commentaries from these participants reflect that the physical plant in some schools was what they call sick buildings that were detrimental to the physical and mental health of the students and teachers. So the students ought to be the primary beneficiaries of educational activities conducted in the space, and as a result, they are more seriously impacted in a negative way. So furthermore, the teachers felt that school administrators did not seem competent in protecting children's rights and well-being. And from a behavioral standpoint, some teachers were concerned that some students exhibited different behavior that did not enhance their well-being and compromise their rights. And the support received from the trained personnel to deal with students who seem to exhibit behavioral issues was minimal. So then in that narrative there, they were speaking about students' behavior, how they manifested maybe antisocial behavior that would compromise their rights as in the school. In the school. And in terms of the capacity building, the teachers suggested that capacity building is paramount to ensure that teachers have the competencies to facilitate the holistic development of their students. But what they are saying that they do not have that. So besides this, they say besides the skills to handle the issues, they need to develop skills to take care of themselves. So they talk about the rights of the child, but what about my rights as a teacher? You talk about well-being of the children. What about my well-being as a teacher? Okay, if I don't cannot take care of myself, I will not be able to take care of the children because they say it is very stressful dealing with these situations that they are unable to handle. Another thing that spoke about was social media. The teachers made statements about the role of social media in children's life. They saw technology as a double-edged sword with many contradictions. And some teachers commented, noting that the cell phones, the computers, the tablets, and social media sites were taken away from the academic and also the social life of the students. So they were saying that the children are so fixated if the gadget, that not just their school life, but also their social lives are compromised. And while they're using the smartphones and the cell phone, although it is regulated within the school system, but the students still find various ways to utilize the device. So what they're looking, although it is a policy of the ministry, okay, where students are not able to turn off their cell phones in class, but they still find ways of using them. Another challenge, another theme that came out in the data was learning disabilities and other learning challenges. And the teachers stated that the children with literacy and numeracy challenges have not yet been diagnosed or given the support needed for their learning. And then they spoke about, due to educational practices, many schools have a one-size-fits-all system that does not consider or cater for children with different learning abilities and capabilities. And then they talk about the limits placed on teachers due to the students' learning challenges. Parents have indicated that teachers were not committed to their jobs despite teachers' expressed commitments, as reflected in some of the vignettes that we got from the data. And in terms of the school as a safe space, the discussion there is that there are questions on the administration of education services and whether existing systems and practices are working in the best interest of all students who may have inherit setbacks that render the administration of education to be an exercise in futility. So implicit in such concerns is whether the education system and legislative arrangements associated with making provisions to establish criteria to treat with such a dilemma. This is especially relevant. These are relevant concerns as it addresses the shortcomings associated with a one-size-fits-all model of education. So we had some recommendations. The team, we talk about the promotion of an inclusive system that supports all children, teachers, and parents, the reformation of the education system to cater to the needs of differently abled children, focusing on the children and what the children would like to do, and providing some trade schools or TICVET education at a very, very early age. And we need to establish programs for spotting disabilities or special needs among children, and the recruitment of social workers and other allied professionals to serve the students. So to conclude, the perspectives of the selected group of teachers operating mostly in environments catering to children living in vulnerable circumstances were interviewed as means of gaining a better understanding of experiences in schools and in communities and within families. So the 8 themes, okay, that emerge from the data are fundamental in terms of looking at how the schools can become a safe space for students and for ensuring that the schools are safe spaces and they are able to enhance or facilitate the well-being of students. Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't share. I couldn't share my.
It was an interesting, a very interesting presentation, even in the absence of a PowerPoint. So thank you, Dr. James and Charles.
Okay, then, thanks.
I would like to invite all of the panelists to once again turn on their cameras. It doesn't seem like we have received any questions. That everyone is still welcome to type their questions in the chat or use the Q&A function. But I did want to sort of reflect on the 4 presentations. I think there was sort of a similar thread along all of them in terms of, as Dr. James and Charles, your presentation is aptly titled about the lack of safe spaces for youth in the different contexts, whether it be Canada, the Dominican Republic, or Trinidad and Tobago. So I also liked what you said, Dr. James and Charles, about this one-size-fits-all approach, and not recognizing the different capacities or identities or contexts from which these children are coming. So I would like to invite the panelists to perhaps reflect on what might be an approach to kind of fix this or to address these gaps that currently exist. I know that's a big question, and I don't think any of us expect you to solve the problem, but perhaps just reflections on your presentation, on this question of what next, what now. So I'll go in order of presentation. So I would like to invite Kristen, Patricia, and Danielle, if any or all of you would like to respond or provide any final words.
Thanks, Veronica. Daniel had to step out, so he just sends his regards. Yeah, it's really interesting to see the link between all of the presentations that we had, and really valuable information in all of it too. And we're all coming from different contexts to this conversation, and it's very interesting to see how these similar conversations are being carried across different regions. And you know, these are issues that people are experiencing, and just promoting schools as a safe space to protect rights, and just thinking about what the role is in teachers in that conversation too. Initially, my first response would be that the teachers can be providing that education, but I'm thinking that given the last presentation, is that maybe it is a bit onerous on the teachers to be doing those types of things as well. So the idea about bringing external people to provide that education, and just really fostering like a community, and just encouraging the youth as well to take up those roles in terms of education and community building, so that they can carry that on to the next generation. And Patricia, if you'd like to add anything as well, thanks.
Thank you. That was really good, Kristen. I just wanted to add one point specifically to our presentation. Kind of talks about the whole idea about placemaking and how important it is to have a physical place where youth can point to and be like, hey, this is my community, this represents my culture, this reminds me of who I am. So I feel like, at least in the context of Canada, I don't know the States or like other countries. So in Canada, the Latin American youth or the Latin American community in Canada right now is still very invisible. So maybe having a physical community, whether it's some, I don't know, cultural celebrations or just festivals, just having that kind of space for youth to have a chance to connect with their culture, to connect with their people. That is really important to me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia and Kristen. Now I would like to invite Laura, Jasmine, or Brenda, if any or all of you had some thoughts or comments.
I can start us off. I think, yeah, it's definitely a big question in terms of how do you kind of address some of these gaps and some of the solutions that, although we are looking at different contexts, there are similarities across. So definitely it was really interesting to kind of hear how schools can become sites of what are supposed to be wellness and safe spaces, but in different opportunities they're not. So yeah, so I think it's a question of like who to some extent is responsible to make sure that these spaces are, and we know that teachers do play a big role, but then it's also difficult to just pinpoint at teachers to kind of mitigate those challenges. So I think it's a good question, definitely food for thought in terms of like how do you kind of address these gaps that we know exist, and kind of who do you point the finger to when there are a lot of different actors at play. But yeah, I definitely echo Kristen's point in terms of like listening and creating that space for you to actually be able to voice their opinions and to like be heard, as opposed to just kind of like voicing their concerns in a void. So definitely bringing up opportunities for those spaces to recognize youth as leaders and recognize their experiences as primal sources of change. So that's kind of, I guess, what I'll add, but thank you.
Hi, yeah, so just continuing off of what Laura said, yeah, so just like immediate ways to address this, like specifically for our presentation, it seems that the onus is on educators would be the most helpful, although educators already do have a lot of responsibility. However, it's just simple things as their tone towards the way a person speaks, so like their accent, or if it's not less than proficient English, then it shouldn't be an issue in the way that they treat them. However, it is often, we judge people, which is what causes these issues and these insecurities in youth sometimes. And that's unfortunately that's a part of the space that they're in. That's what I have.
I just want to say, I think it's really important to also acknowledge the system itself, like get them to give educators better resources to help these children instead of just expecting them to work with what they already have. And I think it's really important to, whether that's bringing in outside resources or working within the means that they're given, but giving them more support to better help these children.
Thank you, Laura, Brenda, and Jasmine for your comments. I do believe we may have lost Anna and Dr. Jameson Charles. If either or both is still here, I would like to invite you to respond. I'll just give them a moment, but I don't think I see either of them. Okay, well, in the absence, I would like to thank our presenters for all of their wonderful presentations. I would like to thank the audience for remaining engaged with us. And once again, a big thank you to the organizers of this event. And we do have our final session, I believe, which will begin in about 20 minutes and will reflect on the lessons learned. And we do invite everyone to join us back then. So thank you, everyone, and we do hope to see you again in 20 minutes.
A pleasant good afternoon to our distinguished panel and audience. I am M. Timos Solowazi of the Oral Tradition Roots Foundation, and I am your chairperson for the last two presentations at this virtual conference. It is my delight to introduce the Assistant Director at the National Family Services Division, Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. Under the division's portfolio, she is responsible for developing planning and coordinated initiatives. With a MSc in Development Studies and a BSc in Sociology from UWI in Mona and St. Augustine respectively, she has over 25 years of experience across government and civil society, focusing on developing, conducting, implementing, and monitoring projects, programs, and policy. Other initiatives are geared towards the national development of Trinidad and Tobago's citizenry. She has worked with and among communities locally and regionally, guiding and supporting community-based initiatives aimed at supporting self-help initiatives and self-sustaining practices in communities. Her areas of expertise are in community engagement and mediation. She is passionate about empowering the young and not so young persons to become their best selves by recognizing their true potential. Not all of us have the privilege of checking off items on our bucket list. Her list included serving as a civil society and community development specialist. Her specialist was with the Program Monitoring and Coordinating Unit of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. She is currently the Senior Officer, Community Engagement and Accountability with the International Federation of the Red Cross, IFRC. And in her free time, she uses her free time to provide support for families in the New Grant area as an entrepreneur and the Full Circle Foundation's co-founder. So it's the RCYP's privilege to have found her speaking on social protection policies for children. I present to you Ms. Kathleen Sarka. The Q&A segment will be led by the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, Ms. Jacqueline Johnson. Ms. Sarika, we are unable to hear you. Could you probably check your audio? I'm not sure what's the problem. If no audio, the technical team could assist.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Danka. You may have to pull the mic down off of the headphone. I think it's at the top of the headphone. Yeah, I think, right. The mic, you bring it down.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, there you go.
There we go. Is this better?
Yes. Thank you.
Ah, yes. Wonderful. Let's start all over again. Good afternoon, everyone. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services is a line ministry with responsibility for social development policy and social service delivery. In keeping with the tenets of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the ministry recognizes that children have a right to family and they must remain in a nurturing, caring, and protective environment. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services makes available through programs, services, and grants financial support for children and their families, inclusive of children with disabilities. This support includes psychosocial support and counseling, financial assistance, and public awareness programs. I will now share my screen. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, social protection of children. Access for all, in particular the poor and vulnerable, to equal rights to economic resources and basic services, including land, property, technology, and financial services. It also provides for the access to education, human rights, and gender equality in an environment of peace and an appreciation for cultural diversity. The right to safe and affordable shelter with basic services, and the right to peaceful and inclusive societies to create and nurture the next generation. Keeping with these goals, the National Development Strategy, Vision 2030 of Trinidad and Tobago is aligned to these goals and is encapsulated in these 17 goals. In particular, theme 1, putting people first, nurturing our greatest asset, is directly related to the established social protection policies for all, including our most vulnerable, such as our children and our youth. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of a Child. The Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child and was ratified on December the 5th, 1991. The CRC is a legally binding international agreement setting out the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of every child, regardless of their race, religion, or abilities. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have a group of children's legislation which is used in support of our children. And these include the adoption of the Children's Act, the Children's Act of 2012, the Miscellaneous Provisions Marriage Act of 2017, the Domestic Violence Act of 2020, the Sexual Offences Act of 2021, the Children's Authority Act of 2000, the Children's Community Residence, Foster Care and Nurseries Act, amended in 2015, the Education Act, and the Children's Life Fund Act of 2010. The National Child Policy, 2020 to 2030, is the first national policy developed for children in Trinidad and Tobago, and incorporates the principles of the UNCRC into its international framework. This provides the overall structure for the care and protection and development of children in Trinidad and Tobago. In addition, the National Child Policy 2020 to 2030 highlights 6 key areas of concern: early childhood development, social protection, health, education, children with special needs, and child protection. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services has a key role to address in addressing these thematic areas. Again, in addition, the draft National Family Policy 2020 to 2025 focuses on the overall well-being of the family and the services and programs needed to create, nurture, and sustain productive and resilient families. Children have a right to families and to live within their families to achieve their highest potential. Our Green Paper and Draft National Parenting Policy 2022 to 2026 focuses on coordinating government's efforts in the provision of the relevant policies, programs, and systems that address both the general population of parents and parents who are deemed vulnerable and may need additional support. The policy aims to provide the required framework to strengthen the capacity of parents and other caregivers to be able to execute their parenting roles and responsibilities to the best of their abilities. Identify the avenues through which these support services will be delivered and expanded, and to uphold the rights of parents and children through the provision of an extensive range of services and programs. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services is the line ministry with the direct responsibility for social development policy and delivery, and makes these available through its key services, delivery divisions, programs, services, and grants. And I will go through a few of them now. The National Family Services Division, whose mandate is to promote healthy family functioning through the provision of preventive, developmental, and remedial programs and services. The NFSD provides counseling, advice, referrals to other state and civil agencies, advocacy, placement for families, and parenting support. The parenting unit in particular was developed to address the need to provide parents, caregivers, and guardians with skills to become more effective parents. To meet this mandate, the parenting unit conducts various workshops and sensitization activities, including co-parenting, parenting for men, general parenting, and parenting for grandparents workshops. Our social welfare division assists in empowering the vulnerable in society to enjoy a better quality of life by providing financial and social assistance in accordance with existing laws and policies. In particular, the Social Welfare Division provides a suite of grants for the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. The following are the grants primarily available to children. Our public assistance grants for children whose parent or parents have died, disabled from earnings, or incarcerated or deserted. Our disability grants for minors for children who live with severe and permanent disabilities. 2,956 children would have received this grant last fiscal year. Our special education grant for children with special needs. This grant is at $800 per month. Our education grant at $500 per month. And our school supplies grant, which is primary school, $700 per month, secondary schools, $1,000 per month, and these figures are quoted in TT dollars. In addition, our National Social Development Program supports children and their families by ensuring that there exists a comfortable living situation by providing grants for a supply of pipe-borne water, electricity, improved sanitary plumbing facilities, and dwelling conditions. It also sets out to empower parents to develop entrepreneurial skills through our SEED program, our Sowing of Empowerment through Entrepreneurial Development, which can further assist their families. Our way forward. The Ministry of Social Development and Family Services has commenced its transformation initiative with the adoption of a holistic approach to service delivery, which defines the family as a unit of measure and carefully examines its core challenges in an effort to craft suitable and sustainable solutions. To this end, the following initiatives have been undertaken. The Social Services Empowerment Unit, SSE, and the Social Transformation and Empowerment Program for Uplifting People, known as STEP UP. Coordinating the holistic development of the ministry's clients to enable them to live more independently. Providing a structure that addresses family vulnerabilities and empowers our citizens to become the agent of their own destinies and their lives. In addition, the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services has in place the Integrated Service Enterprise Management System, also known as ISEMS, which is a robust technological information technology solution aimed at streamlining service delivery using a case management approach. Our social mitigation plan ensures expansion of food security and the growth of micro and small enterprise within households and communities. Our National Register of Vulnerable Persons, which aims to significantly improve how the government identifies and targets the poor and vulnerable in our society. The ministry also collaborates with other national agencies to ensure the care and protection of children and has developed protocols for the use of the National Children's Registry, the referral system of the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Children's Courts of Trinidad and Tobago. In closing, I would like to just indicate the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services remains committed to positively transforming the lives of the people of Trinidad and Tobago through the provision of quality social services that ensures that no one is left behind. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much. We now open the floor for any questions to be answered by the Permanent Secretary. We have 5 minutes to this segment. The floor is open.
I'm sorry, I heard my slides weren't moving. We're not moving. I do apologize. I don't know what happened.
If no questions, we'd like to ask the Permanent Secretary, Ms. Jacqueline Johnson, to give some closing remarks, if you wish. Ms. Johnson.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting us to this forum. The Ministry of Social Development, as Ms. Saka has indicated, has always been the agency that delivers on government social protection system directly to its clients. From what I've heard here today, we seem to be experiencing similar challenges throughout the region. And it suggests a greater need for us to collaborate with each other as we develop and enhance our various social protection systems. One of the important things we recognized in the last session was the importance of the education system to the development of children and the inequity or inequality that we see in the system that we need to address. And I think the Ministry of Social Development has to play a key role in supporting the education system to ensure that our children get to where they need to be. That social protection framework for care and protection has to be enhanced in such a way that our children benefit and achieve their highest potential through the use of the system and through the support mechanism in the system. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask Dr. James is this whole concept of how we see assessment being integrated into the education system so that we identify our children very early for social protection measures, so that we don't wait until they get to the point where we consider them a juvenile or we define them as children in conflict with the law. I think what is required is early assessment of those children. We put them within the scheme of the social protection system so that we support them, we support their families, and we support their education process. And I think that would do well to fix some of the challenges that we see in the current system. We cannot continue to build rehabilitation centers for our young people. We formerly call them young training centers. In some countries, they are simply called prisons. And we cannot continue to deny the child the opportunity to live in community residences without families. And those are some of the things that we really need to focus on in order to build the care and protection system for children. And I'm not saying that we at times we should always leave children in families, but I'm saying that we need to be careful when we lift the children out of the families to ensure that we're replacing them with an appropriate family as opposed to putting them in these big institutions, whether you call them prisons or community residences, whatever. We must ensure that we are replacing the family in a way that meets the needs of the child and the Convention on their rights. And that is the essence of any good social protection system, whether we do it by a foster care or adoption. It doesn't matter how we do it. What we need to ensure is that the child is adequately placed in a family for nurturing. And that's where I think the Ministry of Social Development, it becomes so important, and what we do there to build families that are nurturing and caring for children. Again, let me just thank the organizers of this. I mean, there was a lot to be learned over the past few days. I wasn't able to listen into all the sessions, but what I've heard is quite exciting in terms of the work being done in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson, and thank you, Ms. Sarika, for that valuable presentation. I myself will be reaching out to the ministry in relation to some of the parenting workshops you all mentioned. Right. Before we move on to our next presenter, and just have some comments, questions, more like comments in the Q&A. Dr. Crawford Brown said, for years I've been talking, but we need to learn from each other's experiences. Also, a question from Dr. Brown, how can we use technology experience gained during the pandemic, very interesting, to ensure that we share our problem and solutions with child welfare systems across the Caribbean? That's a very good question, because we had 2 years of trial and error to get this thing right into how we use technology now to really bridge some of these gaps. Very, very good question. And Rodney Siraj, very informative presentation on the rollout of social programs for children and families. But the reality and research suggests that our students are not benefiting from these programs, where the results of these programs measured. How successful were they, and what are the challenges faced? So we like to move on to our, yes, Dr. Brown, correct. Let's move on to our next presenter. But before we continue, let me thank you for your indulgence, for your participation at this RCYP virtual conference. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker in this August lineup of presenters, the current interim president of the Association of Caribbean Social Work Educators. She's a member of the executive committee of the North American and Caribbean Association of Schools of Social Workers. For the past 18 years, she has been at the UWI St. Augustine campus as a social work educator. She's fully committed to social work and social justice education, specializing in building competencies in professional practice with all vulnerable populations in the Caribbean, including child and youth at risk, marginalized communities, survivors of trauma and violence. I present to you our final speaker for this RCYP virtual conference, speaking on lessons learned. This, you can't risk to miss. Join me as I present to you Dr. Karen Nathaniel DeCaris. Following the Q&A, we'll have the vote of thanks carried by Ms. Shivana Chankar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solwazi. Let me just make sure everyone can hear me clearly. I've had to change location a little bit for this final presentation. Is anybody hearing me? Tell me, somebody wave to me. Tell me that you're hearing me. Nice.
Yes. Yeah, you loud and clear.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
loud
for
and
that.
clear.
Thank you for that welcome, Mr. Solwazi, and thank you to everyone who has stayed to the end of this conference for this lessons learned presentation. So just a little bit about where this lesson learned from RCYP-TT came from. For this last few days, we've had a number of presentations from the RCYP project. And one of the things that together with Dr. St. Bernard, Safia King, and Shivana Chankar, one of the things that I attempted to do was to pull out some takeaways from the RCYP-TT. So I have looked at the data, working alongside these very, very auspicious, this panel of people who have worked on this project. I see myself very much as a fledgling in this project. And I have had the opportunity to look at the data, to listen to some of the presentations, and I have come up with or identified a number of lessons, a number of takeaways. So just very, very quickly, we have heard about the project for these last few days. We know that the project was undertaken in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago here in the Caribbean, and it was organized around these 6 thematic areas. We have already explored the methodologies used in this project. Were both quantitative and qualitative methods. We had secondary data was used. The team used some quantitative surveys with children and youth, specifically focusing on different forms of violence. We looked at, the team also looked at ethnographies of organizations, and then we used a number of platforms to disseminate the information so that people could be a part of this project. There were a number of different methods used. We used key informant interviews, in-depth interviews. There was some secondary data analysis, some institutional mapping, and then there were virtual interviews as well, because there was some overlap with the COVID-19 pandemic. There were 2 questionnaires that were developed. Both questionnaires were designed to gather data from children and young people about their interaction with social media and information technology, and also around violence and their exposure to violence. 46 schools were targeted. 14 schools eventually agreed to participate in this survey, and a total of 407 questionnaires from the quantitative surveys were collected. So the data that I have used to share some of these lessons comes from these surveys. I heard Dr. Henry Parada say something day before on Wednesday about the guiding question for the RCYP overall had to do with the factors influencing the implementation of the UNCRC in different countries. What were the promoters of the implementation of these conventions, and also what were some of the barriers. So I kept that also in the back of my mind as I began to draw out some of these lessons. We have identified 20 lessons so far. And I say so far because the more we delve into the data, the more might emerge, and the more that we can learn from these findings. So lesson number 1, that children and youth are widely recognized in Trinidad and Tobago as a special population. We can safely say that there is some commitment in Trinidad and Tobago to childcare, to children's rights, to children's protection, and it is reflected. This recognition is reflected in the number of service providers that are operating in the space of services to children and youth: public agencies, private providers, for-profit providers, not-for-profit providers, faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, people like Mr. Solwazi himself, who works with young people to help them to develop their voice. So you have these interested persons in the welfare of youth, and we can safely say, coming out of what we have learned on this project, is that there is widespread recognition that children and youth form a very special population in need of attention. Lesson number 2, that the principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child have been widely accepted in the formal systems in Trinidad and Tobago. And we see that in the significant development in public service delivery to children and youth in under 20 years. I would check it. We can check it from the year 2000, but really a lot of the work, a lot of the advancements in this space, in state service delivery to children and youth, has actually occurred from 2004 with the Student Support Services Division introduction of school social work. But from 2010, 2012, 2014, the development of the family court, etc. So we know that there are several developments in the public space, and also several child advocacy organizations have also emerged. So for me, this signals that we have recognized that these child rights principles are important and they are accepted as necessary for the development of services and for the quality of service delivery that is given to children and youth and of course their families and caregivers. There are several state-led alternatives to formal education for marginalized youth. Plenty programs for young people on the margins. Police youth clubs, civilian conservation corps, My Part, which offers vocational training. And I know that it had stopped for a while, but I see that it has recently been reintroduced. The MyLat program, which is a military-based program, and Dr. St. Bernard spoke about that on Wednesday. The youth camps, which have also been reinvigorated, I think, and brought back on stream. The server life centers that are all over the country. And what was formerly the detention center for male youth falling under the prison services, the youth training center has been redefined as a youth training and rehabilitation center, following more of a residential and rehabilitation mode than a detention or an imprisonment mode. So we are seeing that that the state has also registered its commitment, and there may be others, has registered its commitment to marginalized youth in Trinidad and Tobago, and these are evidenced in the number of programs, and a lot of these programs participated in the data. Lesson number 4, that maybe the CRC principles are less evident in long-standing programs to children and youth. While we see that the UNCRC has been implemented in the development of new programs like the Children's Authority, the Children Court, the Child Protection Unit of the TTPS, some of the older, long existing programs like in education, in health, and in child welfare may have been slower to incorporate the principles. And my suggestion is that it may be more challenging to change, to reform policy and programs in line with the CRC than it may be to just create new programs. And isn't that what Karl Marx said? Let's, mash up the thing and start again, right? Rather than be trying to fix, because what we end up doing is trying to retrofit into the status quo, and sometimes it pays. We pay kind of, the homage that we pay to the thing is not really in line with. So when we look at some of the long-standing programs, the education system, the healthcare system, the child welfare system, maybe the UNCRC principles are less evident in those due to the challenges of policy reform. Lesson number 5, that in the informal sector, and we're talking here even in families, but certainly in childcare, residential facilities, etc., material and educational welfare of children is prioritized. And I think we can say that across the board in families, that people are trying to provide basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, educational resources, making sure children go to school, making sure that they perform well, behavior regulation and the enforcement of proper behavior and children behaving themselves. Those are priorities, I think, very much in the informal sector. And we heard that in some of the data from the caregivers in these residential institutions, that they care for the children, they really do, and they're doing their best to do what they know how to do with whatever little they have. They are resilient, as Ms. Safia King shared also on Wednesday, that they are very resilient and they try their best. They're doing their best because they say they really love the children. They are concerned with their financial capacity to provide for children and youth. Maybe there is less recognition of risks to children. Risks outside of basic needs. There are other risks to children, children's safety, etc., that maybe in our informal sector, we are not so we don't recognize as easily, that there is less attention to children's emotional well-being. While as adults, we are disturbed, people are disturbed and alarmed by children's experiences. There's not always the acknowledgement of children's trauma and the fact that that trauma will play out in different ways in children's lives and behaviors, etc., etc. And so in the informal sector, there seems to be less acknowledgement of the application of the children's rights approach and openly recognizing the rights of children. This is not an indictment against the informal sector, but recognizing that Maslow did say basic needs are such a high priority in all of our lives, and that continues to be so. Lesson number 6, that the mechanisms for data collection on children and youth in Trinidad and Tobago seem to be weak. There's very little up-to-date information. There is the data collection of itself is not doesn't seem to be routinized or prioritized in a lot of sectors. There's no central database on children and youth, although the Children's Authority had mounted a children's registry that had been come on board and then taken off and so on, and it has been reintroduced in 2020 as a holistic database that's accessible by all key stakeholders. And in a UNICEF Children's Authority partnership under the UN Spotlight Initiative, a web-based case management system has been created to try to streamline child protection response and interagency collaboration. So outside of these two, and these could be huge contributors to the data availability around children and youth. But within the time of collecting this data, there was that gap that was identified with respect to data collection in general. Lesson number 7, that social research with children and youth can be very challenging to undertake for a lot of reasons. And we've seen that also manifest in this project. Research ethics approval processes can be very complex because on the one hand, you may have ethics committees within higher education institutions, academic institutions, but then you have research processes and protocols within individual institutions and the individual agencies that also need to be navigated. So it can be quite complex. The informants themselves may be a bit skeptical about participating. How is this data going to be used? And I don't know if it will reflect me and my service in the best way. Participants can be guarded. People are hesitant for children to participate. So they don't know what children will say. People are unsure about, again, what children will say in these sessions. Agency protocols around confidentiality and protection of information tend to be very, very tight. And so it becomes very challenging. The vestiges of post-colonial societies, we have very strict bureaucracies. We have to climb up and down the ladders of bureaucracy in order to get anything done, including trying to get permission to conduct research. And agency time and researcher time may not always align. Lesson number 8, the RCYP has clearly identified a number of special concerns within the population of children and youth: child sexual abuse and adolescent sexual grooming, child neglect, children on the move or children who are caught up in the migration process, peer-to-peer violence, technology-assisted victimization, child protection in places of safety, marginalized male youth, and of course the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on services to children and youth. So these are extra special concerns, and again, there may be others that were, but these will certainly seem to emerge from the data from the RCYP TT. So the data, in looking at the data, looking at the quantitative data in particular, I have, have kind of suggest a few things. That lesson number 9, adolescent boys, it seems, are more likely to be physically attacked. The data suggests that 80% of males versus 50% of females have been hit at some time without a weapon. 41% males versus 15% females have been hit with a weapon. So clearly the statistics show that all of our children are vulnerable to physical harm, but our males seem to be more likely to be the victims of some kind of physical attack, victims of physical crime. Lesson number 10, adolescent females are more likely to be verbally abused by adults. Our RCYP data suggests that 56% of females versus 25% of males have experienced verbal abuse by adults that has been particularly painful to them, that they have been very, very upset by. And this is also something for us to think about, again, in the informal sector. How are we communicating with our children, and how are the messages that we are sending to our females? Lesson number 11, that the physical abuse of children by adults is still very common. The data suggests that almost 40% of youth have been physically hurt by adults in their lives. And this is what our young people have shared with us. So physical abuse still, it continues, despite, again, all of our attention to the physical abuse of children. Lesson number 12, peer-to-peer victimization, it seems, is very common. The RCYP data suggests that 2 in 3 youth have been hit by a sibling or a peer. So a friend, a colleague, a classmate. 6 in 10 youth have been subject to name calling by their colleagues, their peers, and males are more likely to be hit in their private parts by siblings or peers. And we see the statistic, we see that statistic there, 40% males versus 9% females more likely to be hit in their private parts by siblings or peers. So we are seeing a level of violence in the relationships and the interaction between our children and our young people. Lesson number 13, the incidence of indirect victimization seems to be high amongst our youth. The RCYP data suggests that as many as 1 in 2 youth have directly witnessed violence, either towards their parent or another person, or they have seen or heard shooting, gunshots, or actually seen somebody be shot. That is a pretty high statistic. As many as 1 in 2 of our youth have indicated that they have been victimized indirectly through witnessing violence towards others. Lesson number 14, many youth are directly affected by traumatic loss. Almost 30% of our youth in the survey have lost a close relative or friend to murder. This is a very serious issue, and the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5TR has added prolonged grief in the list of mental health disorders. And so we do have to consider the extent to which many of our young people may suffer from the trauma of loss in the present, but how much of that grief may be extended into adulthood over a prolonged period of time. Lesson number 15, the actual incidence of sexual victimization could be very difficult for us to estimate. when again looking at the survey, when we review the 8 questions in the survey that address sexual victimization, the figures, the numbers, the percentage of students actually indicating yes was much, much lower than for any other category, any other question around victimization, just about 7 to 8%. Now, we don't want to second guess the data, but this finding is inconsistent with other sources. A recent Spotlight survey found that 72% of respondents in that survey knew of cases against sexual abuse of girls and 36% against boys. So we may need to look at this again and how we are creating opportunities for young people to share in the difficult experiences that they've had. Lesson number 16, children's authority is the standard bearer, is the policy and decision maker, is the oversight institution for child protection in Trinidad and Tobago, a huge institution with a number of moving parts. It's both authorized to enforce, in a sense, the UNHCR and child protection, but it has to also be accountable for the status of child protection in Trinidad and Tobago. All agencies, everyone defer to Children's Authority in matters involving children and youth, whether it's in schools, whether it's in the healthcare sector, wherever there's a child abuse case, call Children's Authority. Child abuse case, call Children's Authority. And so it makes the workload for the Children's Authority huge. The Children's Authority is overburdened, understaffed, and very, very vulnerable to high levels of turnover. There's also a loss of individual agency, confidence, and autonomy to respond to child abuse, to cases, and to reports that because they are deferring to Children's Authority and they're not, and many agencies are not in fact tackling those matters themselves. I'm close to the end and I know I'm over time. Lesson number 17, the NGOs comprise what seems to be a parallel children's services network, that you have the state instruments and then you have the NGO sector. There might be some interaction at some points, but it's important to note from the information that was shared in the interviews that not all providers are recognized and registered with the Children's Authority. Not all cases of child abuse, child protection, etc., may come through the Children's Authority. But here we have a very good opportunity for private-public partnerships to create a tighter safety net. Lesson number 18, social media engagement is high. This is no surprise to us. It is no surprise. Most popular platforms use YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat. By 90% of females are using Snapchat. And what is Snapchat? They are actually sharing photographs. And we know that there is another conversation to be had about the quality of what kind of photographs are shared most commonly. WhatsApp, email, and online gaming. Another conversation to be had about the type of games and what the games expose young people to. Over 40% males and 50% females have friend requests of followers who are strangers. That I found also to be an interesting statistic. So almost half of our young people are interacting with strangers, and that may be good, but there is also a risk associated. Recreational and entertainment purposes are the main uses of social media. They are viewing content, not necessarily creating content, but there's also access to educational material. Lesson number 19, cyberbullying is very real. It's very real. While 50 to 25% of the youth in the survey identified as being victims of online bullying, 50 to 60% of them admitted to seeing other people being bullied on social media. So we know that the second statistic is probably closer to the reality of young people who are being bullied on social media, and the final the lesson number 20. It's not the last lesson, but lesson number 20. Youth are really indeed exposed to violence content and sexual content via social media. 40% of the youth in the survey receive and share violent content. 99% of the males in the survey have admitted to viewing pornographic material via social media. 30% of them within the last year. Now, this is also a concern, and there's some work that is being done in the UK around youth access to pornographic material. Why are young people accessing pornographic material, and how it is playing out in dating violence? And that is also something for us to look at. And so overall, my final points are that each of these lessons creates opportunities for further research on children and youth. Every one of these 20 can be spun off into a new project, into another project. There have been tremendous gains in the social and private sector. We want to acknowledge those. There are potential gaps in childcare and protection, which have been identified by the RCYP. Attention is needed on the quality of our social experiences between our young people, or between our children and young people, given the level of violent interaction. There's no stopping the social media revolution. There's no stopping it, for good, but also for negative. And crime and violence in society seems to be creating a vicious circle. As our societies become more violent, our young people are more exposed to violence. It increases the risk that they will bring violence to bear against each other, and the cycle could continue. Friends, thank you very much for this time and this opportunity to share some insights. I want to say very clearly that these were just insights from the data, and there may be more. There may be other things that we can look at and we can share and talk about further. Thank you, Mr. Solwazi. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. De Caires. At this time, we would like to re-invite Ms. Johnson from the Ministry of Social Services and Family Division for us to go through some Q&A. We have a lot of questions have been posted in the chat and also at the Q&A. So we invite Dr. De Caires and Ms. Johnson both to be online here with us, and we'll go through some of these questions. So looking at the Q&A first, because the chat is live, very much alive. So we look at Dr. Crawford Brown asks, how can we use technology experience gained during the pandemic to ensure that we share our problem and solutions child welfare systems across the Caribbean? So we could take either Dr. De Caires or Ms. Johnson. Who want to take a go at this question?
If I can.
Yes.
I think there is a lot for us all to learn about the use of social media and the potential for social media. And technology we are now dated. I think many of us, certainly in my generation, can be easily dated by just the pace of technological advancement. So I think first thing is that we must open ourselves up to the capacity, right? The potential of social media to really for us to capitalize on this opportunity. I say, I know some things about information technology and not a lot. So the full potential is unknown, but I know of some work that has been done in Africa, etc., around behavior change in Africa, as well as in South America, in Brazil, around using social media to promote behavior change that is quite interesting, and maybe there's a lot for us to learn from some of those projects. I don't know if I answered your question, Dr. Crawford Brown.
And very well, if I may, I would like to add that up to this morning, I had a session with some students at Soval, and I was speaking to both parents and children. I was telling them that one of the problems we have as adults, and I'm glad you mentioned that on your side, Dr. De Caires, is that we don't understand technology.
We don't know what they know.
Yeah.
We don't know what they know.
Yeah.
This is their world.
Yeah,
All of us, well, certainly as I say,
told parents that I said we met it, but they are growing up in it.
That's
There's
correct.
a big difference.
That's correct. It makes a big difference. Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. A lot of it is instinct for them, whereas for us, it's learned.
Yes.
Learned behavior. Yes.
So going back again to the Q&A. So this
may
one,
I?
Ms. Johnson?
Yes, may I just add?
Yes, yes, please, yes.
Yes, that I agree totally with the Dr. Perez, is it? But just to add that one of thank you. One of the things that we really need to do and to learn from each other, because of the newness of the thing, is how we changing those values, those attitudes and behaviors to in our young people, in our children, to bring it up to a standard that brings the kind of cohesion and harmony that we want in society and communities. And yes, there's a lot of work being done in terms of values, attitudes, and behaviors. Ministry of Social Development is also embarking on a nationwide campaign to treat with values, attitudes, and behaviors. One of the most challenging areas is how we deal with the young people and children. In terms of changing that culture associated with social media, so it functions in a form that is very supportive. I also want to say that one of the things that we are not doing, or we're not doing it well enough, is sharing our experiences and sharing how we are solving our challenges and filling those gaps in the protection system for children and young people in the Caribbean. And there's a lot happening in other countries in a lot of social protection areas. Like, for example, St. Lucia is well advanced in terms of building their electronic system for domestic violence, for example, and for youth development. But we don't seem to be able to tap into there. One of the most enlightening thing for me when I was at the office of the Prime Minister was to discover that St. Lucia has this fantastic domestic violence registry that we could have tapped into. And we went and we spoke to them, spoke to the UN, and we were able to secure it in Trinidad for our own use. I don't know if it has been translated or offered to the other Caribbean islands, but these are things, the technology that would enhance our capacity to bring the issues and the vulnerable people so that we can help them. We're not using it to our advantage. And we have to adopt the posture that we don't want a perfect system, but we want one which would adequately identify who are the people in need of care, who are the people in need of social protection, who are the children who are not being attended to via this normal curving learning system that we have. So only the normal children in the middle there are attending to, while the weak ones at the end and the very brilliant one on the other side who would always get through and maybe without support are succeeding. So, and there's a lot of systems out there in Armenia, which is not the best developed country, but there are systems out there that are being used. And as I said earlier, even in the Caribbean, and we're not sharing. And we need to get fora like these so that we can share that kind of information. And the UN system does it all the while, because when we go to ECLAC and PAHO seminars, we see where other countries are doing things, and we say, well, listen, we could use a model like that. You know, we can use a strategy like that. It is that kind of sharing that I think we need to do a lot more in the Caribbean to move us ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm seeing that we are running out of time.
Yes, Mr.
What?
Solwasi, I have to, Chair, thank you so much, but I am going to have to leave. I did check the chat and there were no
Yeah.
other specific questions. I'm sure Ms. Johnson may be able to field any other questions that there are. But again, I want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank the RCYP team. Everyone, have a wonderful weekend. Shubh Diwali from Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank
Take
you very much.
care.
Enjoy your holidays. So it's very unfortunate we have to wind up, but before we wind up, there's a question that Dr. St. Bernard would like to answer, right? And after you answer that question, we'll call on we'll get some news. We'll call on Ms. Shivana Chankar to give the vote of thanks. And I want to make a plug, Dr. St. Bernard, in terms of the questions in the chat, because the chat is very, very lively. Could we respond to those questions and send it out to the panelists and the audience? It will be very nice to really still keep that engagement, because someone was asking that we have like a quarterly convening, right? So there's some things we could look at. So Dr. St. Bernard, how does the ministry treat with children diagnosed with special needs whose parent has been diagnosed with mental health issues and cannot work consistently? Dr. St. Bernard, floor is yours.
Are you expecting me to provide an answer to that? Because the way it is phrased, it seems as though the ministry should provide an answer to that.
Well, I saw in the Q&A it said Dr. St. Bernard would like to answer this question live.
No, I did not say anything like that. So I don't know where that came from. I mean, what I would like to comment on is the statement made by my colleague, Dr. Crawford Brown, about using social media to sort of extend the virtues of what of advancing the cause of this engagement. And already what we are doing is using social media to just do that. And I am happy that, she would raise an issue like that, because what it tells me is that in the future, we have to continue these engagements. We listened a while ago from Dr. DeCaries about all the lessons that were learned, and she proffered a number of possible projects that we can embark on in order to do justice to those lessons that have come forth. And I think, we have to form an alliance involving a number of key players, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, because this conference is a Western Hemisphere conference involving colleagues from Central America, involving colleagues from Canada. And as you listen to the papers, and some of the papers dealt with the same themes, they resonate well with one another, because we seem to have the same kind of problems and we have to arrive at solutions. So what we are talking about here in the context of Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean may probably also extend to our colleagues in Central America and in Canada, and we should also be embracing them in whatever discussions we have, starting from the work that has been done through the RCYP. And I will take great pleasure in coordinating this effort across the Western Hemisphere to ensure that, we not only look after the interests of children here in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the circum-Caribbean, and even in terms of the respective diasporas in Canada. We have to talk, and I think social media is the mechanism through which that can happen. Long ago, we would have to jump on planes to get together in one destination, or perhaps be writing letters that would take months to get to another place. We can talk instantaneously by these means. So let us get it done. We have to embark upon rigid data collection. We have to be able to harmonize our data collection efforts. We have to be able, having collected the data, and so on to apply the data to the problems that they're supposed to address. And we have to have mechanisms in place for monitoring and evaluation and for discussing the results and further lessons learned and all of that. And those things can happen via the technology. So I think we are on track and we have to demonstrate a commitment towards these ideals. I also want to say, put in a statement there with respect to Ms. Johnson's statement about St. Lucia and the domestic violence registry that they have there. I want to let it be known that St. Lucia learned about that domestic violence registry from Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is the one that really started that ball rolling. And I can talk from now till doomsday about that, right? St. Lucia picked it up and they run with it. And it is because St. Lucia has a healthy respect for trusting the science. And St. Lucia has a healthy respect for collecting data and spending money and putting their money where their mouth is to make things happen, right? There also has to be some trust towards sustainability of process. And you can't start something and drop it like a hot bread and expect it to survive. We went there in Trinidad and Tobago to get these things rolling and they never rolled. Right? St. Lucia has picked it up and run with it, and there are one or two other countries who are really trying as well. So I think it's good that we are having these discussions and we can see the errors in our ways, and we have to correct ourselves and get our acts together. And I've put in a few things in the chat that people can take time to read. I mean, I've been around for 40 years doing all of this stuff, and I know what we did and what we accomplished and what we undid after having done it. So I can talk from now till, as I said, doomsday about these problems. I've said my piece. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. St. Bernard. And sorry for that mix up with the questions a while ago. We need to wind up in the next 8 minutes. We have a question here. I might throw it out to anyone who would like to attempt this question here. For the children who underperformed in the recent SCA pandemic cohort, how are they being further facilitated in the secondary schools other than the work of the MOE's SSS, Student Support Services, especially since they are still being impacted by COVID and other flus and viruses? What systems are being considered to bring them up to scratch with their counterparts? It's an open question. We could close off with that question. It's a lot to think about. Anyone from the ministry would like to answer that question? Anyone from the RCYP team?
Can I answer that question? Try my best.
Yes, thank you.
That's a very loaded question, because one of the things I think there were some issues with the SCA. Sorry, I usually mix because of my St. Lucia background. We are one of the things that we need to be mindful of in terms of that question is that the students have just come back, and there are a number of variables, a number of issues that are still impacting students from that standpoint. So the Ministry of Education, because as an educator, you cannot just put plasters and saws or one size fits all thing. It has to be evidence-based. So what the ministry has been doing since the students had realized this year, the students did poorly in the SCA exam, and they had to do some remedial work with them during the summer holidays and stuff to bring them up to scratch. So what is happening now is that because the COVID is still with us, and there are students who are still sick and they're still out of school, and then the teachers get sick of COVID and they have to spend the 14 days out. it is, the Ministry of Education, in my opinion, is caught between a rock and a hard place right now. So maybe as soon as that may have stabilized, and then we have a way of saying, well, COVID may not be, it will be with us, but it's not as prevalent as it is. Then we could start looking at ways in which we could assist the students. But for now, they're trying their best in terms of, because the student support services there, they're strapped from a resource standpoint, so they cannot use the resources that they have and the people that they have. And I think that they are employing new people. I know people, they have a new set of people that have been employed to be able to deal with that. But it just started. So we have to give them some time to see, because we have to work on based on evidence, because sometimes we may think a child needs that particular thing, but without the testing and the assessment of the child, we may be misdiagnosing or something. So we need to make sure that whatever we do it well from the inception. That is what I could say for now from that standpoint.
Yes, sorry. Thank you very much for that contribution. At this time, we'd like to call on Mr. Lionel Remy to move the vote of thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, Chair. I feel honored to have the opportunity to do a vote of thanks for this special event. I want to thank the honorable delegates. First of all, the Pro-Vice Chancellor, Graduate Studies, Professor Audrey Henry Lee, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, UWI, Dr. Akoya Lewis Cameron, Director of the School of Social Work, Dr. Valerie Borum, the RCYP Lead Researcher, Professor Henry Parada, University Director, Regional Sciences Director, Professor Don Marshall, based in Barbados, and RCYP Lead Researcher in the Caribbean, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, for their presence and valuable communications at the opening ceremony. It gives me the greatest pleasure to extend a heartfelt thanks to the University Salices team, especially Dr. St. Bernard, Acting Director Salices. Thank you, Dr. St. Bernard, for your leadership in making this conference a great success. I'd also like to thank the Toronto Metropolitan team, formerly known as Ryerson University, especially Professor Henry Parada, lead researcher based in Canada of Toronto Metropolitan University, and Veronica for their support and assistance. In addition, I must thank the organizing committee, especially the secretary of the conference, Ms. Sophia King, for her dedication, stamina, and the important role she played in organizing this conference. Also, special thanks are in order to Ms. Josanne Green from the UWI Marketing and Communications team and her technical assistants, Ms. Alicia Shepard and Ms. Samantha Amogan. Lastly, a sincere thank you to all presenters, chairpersons, and participants in this Caribbean, Central America, and Canada, and even worldwide, and the diaspora as well, who made this event very memorable. One of the objectives of this conference was to expose individuals to the RCYP research and its importance in examining the factors that protect and hinder children's rights and youth well-being. It's important that we continue to rely on research and evidence in order to improve the performance of our programs directed at children and youth in the Caribbean, Central America, and North America. Thank you all and have a great evening. Please reach home safely. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lionel. Enjoy your weekend, everyone. Please be safe. Have a good holiday. on Monday, please, God.